I needed that money yesterday, my son demanded, handing me his wife's $300,000 debt like it was a simple utility bill. Don't disappoint me, Mom, he added. I just smiled, pouring more coffee while he checked messages on his phone. 6 hours later, my account was at zero. When they returned that night, looking for the money, they found the table empty. Just one envelope left on the table. When they opened it, their faces went pale. But before we continue, make sure you're already subscribed to the channel, and write in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We love to know how far our stories are reaching. The doorbell rang at 7:30 a.m. on a random Tuesday. 3 insistent rings as if the world was ending. I already knew who it was before I even opened the door. My son Richard only showed up unannounced when he needed something. I left my half-drunk cup of tea on the kitchen table and walked slowly down the hall. Through the living room windows, I saw his car, a luxury SUV, parked haphazardly in the driveway. Richard had inherited his father's talent for business, but not a drop of his patience or consideration. When I opened the door, he already had his cell phone in one hand and a brown paper envelope in the other. His face, always so much like his father's, was tense. "Mom," he said, brushing past me without a hug, just a quick kiss in the air. "We need to talk." Richard went straight to the kitchen as if the house were still his, even though he'd moved out more than 15 years ago. He sat in my chair, put the envelope on the table, and started checking his phone while I followed him. "Coffee would be good," he muttered without looking up from the screen. I poured the coffee mechanically. 10 years a widow, and I still served the men in my life as if it were my only function. As I placed the cup in front of him, I noticed how tense his hands looked, his knuckles white as he typed. "Is Jessica okay?" "The kids?" I asked, referring to my daughter-in-law and my grandchildren, whom I barely ever saw. "They're fine," Richard answered vaguely. He finally put the phone away and took a sip of coffee. "I'll get straight to the point, Mom. I have a problem." I sat on the other side of the table. On the wall clock, the minutes ticked by slowly. "Jessica got into a complicated situation." He continued, pushing the envelope toward me. "She made some investments that didn't pan out." I opened the envelope carefully. Inside were bank statements, collection notices, and a document that looked like a loan contract with a figure highlighted in red. $300,000. My heart sped up. It was almost all of my retirement money plus what was left from the sale of the downtown Chicago apartment after Edward passed away. "Richard," I began, feeling my throat go dry. "This is practically everything I have." He took another sip of coffee, his cold eyes finally looking at me. "Mom, it's not like you need that money. You live alone in this house that's already paid off. Your expenses are minimal, and for God's sake, you're 68 years old. What are you saving it for?" His words hit me like a slap. The house was the only valuable asset I had left, and it was still in his name. Edward's decision years ago to avoid problems with the inheritance. "It's not that simple," I argued. "I have my medications, my doctor's appointments." Richard tapped the table gently, cutting me off. "Jessica invested badly, okay? She trusted someone she shouldn't have." He took a deep breath. "If we don't pay this by tomorrow, things are going to get ugly. These aren't bankers, Mom. They're dangerous people." "What kind of dangerous people?" I asked, my voice almost disappearing. "You don't need the details," he said impatiently. "Just trust me. It's a loan, right? I'll pay you back as soon as I reorganize the company's finances." I looked at the envelope at my son's face at the door leading to the backyard where he used to play. Now it was as if a stranger was sitting in my kitchen. "You've asked me for loans before, Richard. I've never seen that money again." His face hardened. "This is serious, Mom. This isn't the time for drama." He stood up, pacing the kitchen like a caged animal. "I'm your only son, your family. You always said you'd do anything for me." There it was, the manipulation I knew so well, the same kind Edward used, the same kind I had allowed my entire life. "I need to think," I said quietly. "There's no time to think." Richard raised his voice. "I need that money in my account before the end of the day. Tomorrow is too late." He stopped behind my chair, putting his hands on my shoulders. I felt their weight like chains. "Mom," he said, softening his voice. "You know, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. It's for Jessica's safety. For our family. Family. The word that always worked on me like a magic spell that made me bend. Give and sacrifice. All right, I finally replied. I'll transfer it. The relief on Richard's face was almost palpable. He smiled for the first time since he arrived. That smile that reminded me of the boy he once was. Thanks, Mom. I knew I could count on you. He checked his watch. I have a meeting now, but I'll be back tonight for dinner and to sort this out, okay? I nodded, unable to speak. Richard took the folder, gave me a quick kiss on the forehead, and headed for the door. Don't disappoint me, Mom, he added before leaving as if I were the child and he were the father. The door slammed shut, and I was left alone in the kitchen with his half-drunk coffee cup and the certainty that I had just made a terrible mistake. Through the window I saw his car speed off, scattering gravel on the garden I had tended with so much care. It was then that an idea began to form in my mind. An idea the old Helen would never have considered. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in a long time. Sarah, it's Helen. I need your help. My friend arrived in less than half an hour. Sarah and I met in college almost 50 years ago. She pursued a career as a lawyer while I dropped out to marry Edward. She never approved of my choices, but she always stayed close patiently, waiting for me to open my eyes. 300,000. Sarah almost choked on the tea I'd served her. Helen, that's insane. It's everything you have. I shook my head, feeling the weight of reality. It's not the first time, Sarah. Last year it was 100,000 to expand the business. Before that, 50,000 to solve a problem with suppliers. I've never seen a dime of it back. Sarah put her cup down on the table hard. And why do you keep giving it to him, Helen? You were always smart. How can you not see what's happening? The question hit me like a punch. Why did I continue? For love, for fear. Out of habit. He's my son, I replied the automatic answer I always gave. And you're his mother, not his bank, Sarah retorted. Edward manipulated you for 30 years, and now Richard is following in his exact footsteps. When is this going to stop? I looked out the window at the garden I had cultivated alone after Edward's death. The roses were finally blooming after years of trying to make them grow in soil that wasn't welcoming. Like me, they had persisted against all odds. Today, Sarah stared at me confused. What do you mean? I took a deep breath, feeling something break and reassemble inside me. I want you to help me transfer all my money to an account Richard doesn't know about. And I want you to help me get out of this house before he comes back. Sarah's eyes widened, then a slow smile spread across her face. Helen, I have waited almost 50 years to hear you say something like that. She pulled her cell phone from her bag. I have a summer condo in Miami that's empty. The keys are at my office. How much time do we have before he returns? He said he'd be back for dinner, so about 10 hours. Sarah looked at the clock. Time enough. We'll go to the bank first. Then we'll stop by the notary so you can give me power of attorney in case you need legal representation. After that, we pack your bags and we're gone. I stood up feeling a mix of fear and exhilaration. I had never made such a radical decision in my entire life. He's going to be furious. I muttered more to myself than to Sarah. She took my hands. Helen, are you afraid of him? I thought of my son's face when he didn't get what he wanted, how his voice changed, how his eyes hardened. Yes, I admitted, just like I was afraid of his father. Then it's time to stop being afraid. Sarah squeezed my hands. Let's get your things. I went to my room and took the suitcase I had only used twice in the last 10 years. I opened the closet and started picking out clothes, but I soon realized I didn't want to take much from that life. Just the essentials. A few outfits, my medications, important documents, and the few pieces of jewelry that had sentimental value. In the back of the dresser drawer, I found the small wooden box where I kept the only money Edward never knew I had. It was small, just a few $1,000s I'd saved, selling crafts and embroidery over the years. My secret, my little rebellion. I picked up the picture frame with my mother's photo and hesitated at the photo of Richard as a child. After a moment, I decided to leave it behind. When I returned to the living room, Sarah was on the phone organizing everything. The flight to Miami is confirmed for 3 in the afternoon. We still have time to go to the bank and the notary. At the bank, the manager seemed surprised by my request to transfer all the money to a new account. "Mrs. Miller, are you sure this is a considerable amount?" "Absolutely," I replied, signing the documents, "and I need this transaction not to appear on statements sent to my home address." While we waited for the transfer to process, Sarah looked at me curiously. "What are you going to leave for Richard? Any explanation?" I thought for a moment. "A note," I decided, "and a lesson he should have learned a long time ago." When we got back to the house, I carefully wrote on a piece of paper that I placed on the kitchen table. "I am the one who is disappointed. Revenge is a dish best served cold." As I walked out the door with my suitcase, I looked at the house that had been my prison for so many years. In the garden, the roses swayed in the breeze, free and strong, just as I would be from that day on. In the taxi on the way to the airport, Sarah took my hand. "Are you okay?" I looked out the window, watching the city rush by, taking decades of submission with it. "No," I answered honestly, "but I will be." Sarah's condo in Miami was small but cozy with a view of the ocean. The first night sitting on the balcony listening to the waves, I turned on my cell phone, only to turn it off again when I saw 17 missed calls from Richard. I wasn't ready to face him. "He'll find you eventually," Sarah said, pouring me a glass of wine. "We need a long-term plan." I nodded, feeling strangely calm. "I never thought I'd have the courage to do this." "I always knew you had it," Sarah smiled. "You just needed a push." In the following days, my phone continued to ring. Richard, his wife Jessica, even my sister Claire, who had probably been recruited to try and locate me. In one of the voicemails, Richard alternated between desperate pleas and veiled threats. "Mom, please call me. I'm worried about you." And then, "You can't just disappear like this. The house is in my name, remember? Think carefully about what you're doing." A week after my escape, I began to rebuild my life. I opened an account at a new bank, rented a small apartment near the beach, and started looking for something to occupy my time. At 68, I had never really worked, but I discovered that my crafts and embroidery had a market at local artisan fairs. Sarah stayed in Chicago, but became my eyes and ears. She was the one who told me about Richard's furious visit to her office. "He was beside himself," she recounted over the phone, "demanding to know where you were threatening to sue, saying you weren't mentally capable of making financial decisions." "And what did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him you were perfectly sane and that if he continued with the threats, I would file for a restraining order." Sarah laughed. He turned red as a tomato. I don't think anyone has ever stood up to him before. At the end of the first month, I received a formal letter from Richard's lawyer. It demanded my immediate return, claiming concern for my mental health, and threatening legal action to declare me incompetent. In the same envelope, there was a handwritten note from Jessica, surprisingly humble. "Helen, please come back. Richard is out of control. The creditors are pressuring us. We need you." I forwarded the documents to Sarah, who handled the formal response attaching recent medical reports, proving my sanity, and a detailed statement of the loans Richard had extorted from me over the years. "They don't have a case," Sarah assured me. "But Richard won't give up easily. He lost his personal bank, and that made him furious." In the second month, I received an unexpected visitor. My daughter-in-law Jessica showed up at my new apartment, pale and noticeably thinner. "How did you find me?" I asked, surprised to see her at my door. "We hired a detective," she admitted, looking ashamed. "Can I come in?" I hesitated, but eventually allowed it. Jessica looked around my small apartment with curiosity. "It's cozy," she commented, clearly surprised to see me living in such a modest space after the spacious house I left behind. "It's mine," I replied simply. "Tea." We sat on the small balcony, the sea visible in the distance. Jessica held the cup with trembling hands. "Things are bad, Helen," she said. "Richard is different, Aggressive. Losing control. How are my grandchildren? I asked, feeling a pang of guilt. Scared. They don't understand what's happening. Richard sold the car. We're trying to sell the beach condo, all to pay the debts. She paused. It wasn't just the $300,000, Helen. There's much more. I wasn't surprised. Edward always had another hidden debt, too. So you didn't come here to convince me to come back, I stated. You came to ask for more money. Jessica looked down. It's more complicated than that. The men we owe, they aren't patient. Richard told them you have the money. A chill ran down my spine. He used me as collateral. Jessica didn't answer, but her silence was confirmation enough. You need to get out of that house, Jessica, I said, taking her hands. Take the kids and go to your parents' house. It's not that simple, she murmured. Richard controls everything. Our accounts, our documents. Her voice failed. I don't know how to get out, just like you didn't know. Her words moved me deeply. It was true. For decades I didn't know how to get out, how to break the cycle, until I finally found the courage. I can help you, I offered. Not with money, but with getting out. Jessica looked at me with a mixture of hope and fear. He'll find us, just like he found you. Then we'll be ready when he does, I replied with a confidence I had never felt before. But first, we need to get you and the children out of that house. After Jessica left with a plan laid out and my new phone number carefully hidden in her boot, I sat on the balcony watching the sunset. The orange horizon seemed like a symbol of my own transformation, from darkness to light. My phone rang. It was Sarah. Jessica found you, didn't she? She asked without preamble. How did you know? Richard showed up at my office again. This time with one of those creditors of his, a terrifying man, scars on his face. They made veiled threats wanting to know where you were. I felt my stomach sink. What did you tell them? I told them that if they laid a finger on you, me, or anyone related to this case, I would make sure they spent the rest of their lives behind bars. Sarah paused. Helen, this is getting dangerous. Richard is desperate. I know, I replied, watching the last ray of sun disappear over the horizon. And desperate people do desperate things. The next morning, I woke up to insistent knocking on the door. For a terrifying moment, I thought Richard had found me, but when I looked through the peephole, I saw an unknown woman. Mrs. Helen Miller, she asked when I partially opened the door, keeping the security chain latched. Yes, I'm Detective Miller. She showed a badge. City Police, we need to talk about your son, Richard Miller. My heart sped up. Did something happen to him? The detective's expression remained neutral. May I come in? I let her in and offered coffee, which she accepted. As I prepared the cups in the small kitchen, I tried to contain the tremor in my hands. Mrs. Miller, the detective began sitting on the sofa. Your son is being investigated for financial fraud, document forgery, and possible involvement with loan sharks. We'd like to know if you were aware of these activities. It felt as if the floor had disappeared from under me. A part of me always knew Richard wasn't honest in his business, just as his father hadn't been, but hearing the words police investigation made it all terribly real. No, I answered honestly. I knew he had financial problems, but not the extent or the nature of them. The detective jotted something in her notebook. You left home suddenly 2 months ago, correct? Can you tell us why? I told her everything. The successive loans, the manipulations, the pressure for the $300,000. The detective listened without interrupting, only making occasional notes. Did he use your name on any documents? Did he ask you to sign papers without explaining what they were? I thought for a moment. A few years ago, he asked me to sign some documents to facilitate financial transfers in case I needed help. He said it was for my protection in old age. The detective nodded. We found several suspicious transactions in accounts opened in your name, Mrs. Miller. Accounts you probably didn't know existed. I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of nausea. Richard hadn't just manipulated me. He had stolen my identity. What happens now? I asked, trying to maintain my composure. We will continue the investigation. Your formal statement will be needed shortly. She hesitated. I must warn you, your son will likely be charged in the coming weeks, and considering the people he got involved with, it would be wise to reinforce your security. After the detective left, I called Sarah, who promised to fly to Miami on the next flight. I always knew Richard was involved in shady things, she said, but I never imagined it would reach this point. That afternoon, I received a message from Jessica. He found out about our plan. I'm locked in the room with the kids. He's breaking everything. My blood ran cold. I immediately called Detective Miller, who promised to send a patrol car to Richard's address. The following hours were a blur of calls, messages, and fragmented updates. By nightfall, all I knew was that Jessica and my grandchildren were safe in a support house, and that Richard had been detained for questioning after resisting the police intervention. Sarah arrived around 9 at night, finding me on the balcony looking at the dark sea. She sat beside me in silence for a few minutes. "How are you feeling?" she finally asked. "Guilty," I admitted. "If I hadn't left, maybe this wouldn't have happened." Sarah shook her head firmly. "No, Helen. If you hadn't left, you'd be sinking right along with him, probably being used for more fraudulent schemes." She took my hand. "You did the only thing you could have done. You saved yourself, and in doing so, you probably saved Jessica and your grandkids too." The next morning, the local newspaper headline took my breath away. "Local businessman arrested for fraud and ties to criminal organization." The photo of Richard being led away in handcuffs seemed to belong to another reality, not mine. The phone rang. It was Detective Miller. "Mrs. Miller, your son is requesting your presence at the station. He insists on speaking only with you." I looked at Sarah, who had already read the news and was watching me with concern. "You don't have to go," she said, "not after everything he did." "Yes, I do," I interrupted, surprising myself. "I need to look him in the eye and end this once and for all." The police station was a cold, impersonal place with fluorescent lights that highlighted every wrinkle on my tired face. Richard was brought into a visiting room handcuffed and wearing a gray uniform that made him look smaller, older. When he saw me, his eyes, so much like his father's, filled with tears. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking, "you came." I sat across from him, keeping my distance. "You wanted to see me. I'm here." Richard looked like a cornered animal glancing around as if looking for an exit. "You don't understand the situation I'm in?" He began leaning forward. "These people, they don't play around. If I don't pay what I owe—" "No," I interrupted, my voice surprisingly firm. "You don't understand the situation you're in. I'm not here to give you money, Richard. That time is over." His face changed. The vulnerability gave way to rage. "You abandoned me when I needed you most. Your own family. Is that what you're going to tell your grandkids, that you let their father rot in jail?" I took a deep breath, refusing to be manipulated again. "I'll tell them their father made bad decisions just like their grandfather, and that I, finally, made a correct one." Richard slammed his handcuffed hands on the table. "The house is in my name. You have nothing." "I have myself," I replied, standing up. "Something I almost lost completely because of men like you and your father." I walked to the door, then stopped and turned. "Jessica and the children are safe. They'll have a chance to start over away from you." I paused. "And so will I." As I walked out of the station, I felt as if an enormous weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The Miami sun was shining brightly, almost blinding after the artificial light of the station. Sarah was waiting for me in the car. "How did it go?" she asked, concerned. I looked one last time at the gray building where I left my son and decades of submission. "Liberating," I replied. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled a real smile. 6 months passed since my escape and Richard's arrest. Winter arrived in Miami, bringing strong winds and a rough sea. My small apartment now truly felt like a home, with my plants on the balcony and the colorful embroideries I sold at the local fair adorning the walls. Jessica and my grandchildren, Luke 8 and Maya 6, had moved to a quiet town upstate near her family. We spoke weekly via video call, a technology I learned to master with Sarah's help. The kids were adapting well to the new life, although they still asked about their father occasionally. "Grandma, when can we visit you?" Luke asked during our last call. "During spring break, I promised. We'll build sandcastles and look for shells on the beach." Jessica's image appeared on the screen, smiling shyly. She looked healthier now, with fuller cheeks and a calmer gaze. "Are you really inviting us, Helen?" "Of course. My apartment is small, but we all fit. It will be good to have the kids' laughter around here." After the call, I sat on the balcony, watching the angry waves break on the beach. Richard's trial was scheduled for the following month. The charges were serious: fraud, forgery, use of false documents, association with a criminal organization. Sarah estimated a sentence of at least 10 years. I had agreed to testify, not for revenge, but for justice. For me, for Jessica, and for everyone else Richard had deceived over the years. The phone rang, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a number I didn't recognize. "Helen Miller," a male, unfamiliar voice. "Yes, who is this?" "This is Roger Mendez, your son's attorney." I felt a tightness in my chest. In recent months, Richard had changed lawyers several times, each promising legal miracles that never materialized. "What can I do for you?" Richard would like to propose a deal. He has information on larger operations that might interest the district attorney in exchange for a reduced sentence, but he needs your help. I took a deep breath, already imagining where this was going. "What kind of help?" "Financial, naturally, to cover the fees of the specialized legal team, $200,000. I almost laughed. The audacity was incredible. "Mr. Mendez, I no longer have that kind of money. And even if I did, I wouldn't use it that way." "Mrs. Miller," his tone hardened, "your son is facing more than 10 years in prison. As a mother—" "As a mother," I interrupted. "I already did what I could for decades. Now Richard needs to face the consequences of his own actions." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "He said you'd respond that way. He asked me to tell you that he still has copies of documents you signed, documents that could implicate you in some of his schemes." My stomach knotted, but I kept my voice firm. "Tell my son that blackmail is just one more crime to add to his list, and that I'm willing to face any accusation if it means finally breaking this cycle." I hung up the phone with trembling hands. I immediately called Sarah and told her about the conversation. "He's bluffing," she assured me. "Any document you might have signed, we've already clarified with the police that it was under manipulation. Besides, the investigation has already established his pattern of behavior." Even so, that night was difficult. I stayed awake, mentally reviewing every paper I signed over the years at the request of Richard or Edward. How many contracts? How many powers of attorney? How many documents that I barely read, trusting that my husband or my son had my best interests at heart? The next morning, I woke up to knocking on the door. It was Detective Miller again, accompanied by another officer. "Mrs. Miller, we need you to come with us to the station. There's been a development in your son's case." On the way, the detective explained. Richard tried to bribe a guard to get a contraband cell phone into his cell. The guard, part of an internal operation, recorded everything. At the station, they showed me the transcript of a call Richard intended to make as soon as he had the phone. It was to one of the men he owed money to, offering my address in Miami as collateral that he would pay his debts. "My mother has money hidden," the transcript read. "If I can't pay, you know where to find her." I read the words, feeling a coldness that seemed to come from inside my bones. My own son was willing to put my life at risk to save his own skin. "Mrs. Miller," the detective spoke gently, "considering this new evidence, we are offering temporary police protection, and we strongly suggest you consider moving again." I returned home escorted by an officer. Sarah was already there, having been informed by the detective. She hugged me as soon as I walked in. "I'm already looking for a new place for you, a gated community with security." I looked around my small apartment, at the plants I had cared for so lovingly, the colorful curtains I had sewn, the view of the sea that brought me peace every morning. "No," I said, surprising myself. "I'm not running again. I'm not going to let Richard continue to control my life, even from behind bars." Sarah looked at me with a mix of concern and admiration. "Helen, these men are dangerous. I know, and I'm going to take all necessary precautions. But this is my home now, the first one I truly chose for myself. I'm not giving it up. In the following days, we installed a complete security system. Cameras, alarms, reinforced locks. The police increased patrols in the neighborhood, and 2 plainclothes officers took turns in a car parked across from the building. Jessica called me panicking after being informed of the situation. "Helen, come here. Stay with us, please." "I'm safe, dear," I assured her. "And I have a life here now. My craft fairs, my friends, my swimming classes for seniors." I laughed lightly. At 68, I'm finally discovering who I am when I'm not taking care of ungrateful men. A week later, when the initial panic had subsided, I received an official envelope. It was a summons to testify at Richard's trial scheduled for 2 weeks later. Sarah, who had stayed in Miami with me, reviewed the document. "Are you ready for this? Facing him in court won't be easy." I looked out the window at the sea that had become my confidant. "I'm ready." The courthouse was an imposing building in downtown Chicago. I returned to the city for the first time since my escape, feeling a strange disconnection from the streets that had been my home for decades. Sarah drove while I watched the urban landscape pass by the window. "Nervous?" she asked as we parked. "Oddly, no," I replied. "I feel like I'm closing a chapter. Finally." In the courtroom, I sat with Sarah in the front row. The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, came to greet us before the session began. "Mrs. Miller, your testimony will be crucial today. Richard is trying to paint himself as a victim of circumstances manipulated by more powerful partners." "He was always good at playing the victim," I commented. The side door opened and Richard entered, escorted by 2 guards. He was thinner, his face marked by deep, dark circles. Our eyes met for a moment, his pleading, mine firm. The judge entered, and everyone rose. The trial began with procedural formalities, followed by the testimony of forensic experts who detailed the complexity of Richard's financial schemes. When my name was finally called, I walked to the witness stand with slow but determined steps. After the oath, the prosecutor began. "Mrs. Miller, can you tell us about your relationship with the defendant, your son?" I looked directly at Richard as I spoke. "I raised him mostly alone after my husband's death 10 years ago. Before that, we lived as an apparently normal family. Only apparently." "What do you mean?" "My husband, Edward, Richard's father, was also manipulative and financially controlling. Richard learned from the best." The prosecutor nodded. "Can you detail how your son manipulated you financially?" I told them everything. The successive loans, the unfulfilled promises, the emotional pressure, the veiled blackmail. In the last episode, he demanded $300,000, practically all my savings, to supposedly pay his wife's debt. When I realized I would never see that money again, just as I hadn't seen the previous amounts, I decided to leave. "What made you make that decision after so many years of giving in to his demands?" I thought for a moment. "It was the contempt in his voice," I answered honestly. "When he said, 'Don't disappoint me, Mom,' I realized he didn't see me as a person, only as a resource to be exploited. In that moment, something inside me broke and reassembled itself in a different way." Richard's lawyer stood up for cross-examination. He was a middle-aged man with an expensive suit and a calculated expression. "Mrs. Miller, do you consider yourself a good mother?" The question took me by surprise. I saw the prosecutor start to object, but I raised my hand slightly. For decades, I believed being a good mother meant giving my son everything: money, time, self-esteem. Now I understand that being a good mother also means teaching responsibility and consequences. "You abandoned your son when he needed you most," the lawyer pressed. "No, sir. I stopped enabling destructive behavior. There's a big difference." "And what about the threats your son supposedly made against you? Doesn't it seem convenient that these allegations arise just when he's about to propose a deal with the DA's office?" I remained calm despite the insinuation. The recordings speak for themselves. And no, it doesn't seem convenient that my own son offered my address to criminals as collateral for his debts. It seems tragic." When I was finally dismissed, I returned to my seat feeling my legs tremble. Sarah squeezed my hand in silence. The trial continued with other testimonies. Richard's employees defrauded clients, even Jessica, who described years of lies and manipulation. The whole time I watched Richard become increasingly agitated, whispering furiously with his lawyer. At the end of the day, when the judge announced a recess until the next morning, Richard looked at me one last time before being led away. There was no longer any plea in his eyes, only a cold hatred that made me shiver. In the hotel that night, I couldn't sleep. Richard's expression haunted me. It was the same expression Edward had when he didn't get what he wanted, a mixture of rage and calculation, as if he were planning his next move. In the morning, we returned to the court to hear the closing arguments. The prosecutor presented a strong case detailing years of fraud and manipulation. Richard's lawyer tried to paint him as a struggling businessman who made mistakes, but not intentional crimes. When the judge retired to deliberate, Sarah and I went to grab coffee at a nearby cafe. I was distractedly stirring my coffee when I noticed a man sitting a few tables away watching us. When our eyes met, he quickly looked away. "Sarah," I whispered. "That man is watching us." She looked discreetly. "Must be a reporter. The case has gained some local media attention." But something about the man's posture, the way he avoided eye contact while clearly monitoring us, alarmed me. "Let's go back to the courthouse," I suggested. As we left, I noticed the man also got up. On the way back, he kept his distance but continued to follow us. At the courthouse, I mentioned the incident to one of the police officers who promised to be vigilant. The session resumed, with the judge returning to announce his decision. "In the case of the State versus Richard Edward Miller, this court finds you guilty on all charges." A wave of relief washed over me immediately, followed by a profound sadness. My son, the child I once held in my arms, was now officially a convicted criminal. The judge continued detailing the sentence. 12 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 4 years, in addition to fines and restitution to the victims. Richard remained impassive during the reading of the sentence. As the guards approached to take him away, he turned in my direction. "This isn't over," he said, loud enough for me to hear. "You're going to regret this." As we left the courthouse, I noticed the same man again watching from a distance. This time, I pointed him out directly to the officer accompanying us. The man noticed and quickly disappeared into the crowd. "We need to go back to Miami today," I told Sarah as we walked to the car. "I don't feel safe here." In the week following the trial, I tried to resume my routine in Miami. The police protection had been reduced to periodic patrols, as Richard's threat seemed less viable now that he was convicted and under constant surveillance. One afternoon, as I was returning from the fair where I sold my embroideries, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked near my building. Something about the vehicle alerted me. Maybe the fact that the windows were too dark, or that it was strategically positioned with a view of the building's entrance. Instead of entering the building, I walked past and called Detective Miller. "It might be nothing," I admitted, "but it doesn't hurt to check. Stay in a public place while we send someone." I went into a nearby cafe and waited, watching through the window. 20 minutes later, a patrol car approached the suspicious car. 2 men quickly got out and tried to walk away, but were intercepted by the officers. My phone rang. It was the detective. "Mrs. Miller, we caught 2 individuals with criminal records. They were carrying unregistered weapons and had your address written on a piece of paper." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Richard's partners?" "Probably. We're questioning them now. Do you have a safe place you can stay for a few days?" I called Sarah immediately. Her response was quick and decisive. "I'll pick you up in an hour. We're going to my beach house in Key West. Nobody knows about it." I returned to my apartment, escorted by police, to pick up some essential belongings. As I packed a hurried bag, I looked around at the home I had built with such care. Once again, I needed to run. Or maybe not. A thought began to form in my mind. An idea that would have seemed absurd to the old Helen, but now made perfect sense. When Sarah arrived, I explained my plan. It's risky, she warned. Living in fear is riskier, I replied, and I'm tired of hiding. The next day, instead of hiding in Key West, I returned to my apartment this time with a clear objective. With the help of Detective Miller and her team, we set a trap. The two arrested men had been persuaded to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. They revealed that Richard, using another inmate's phone during visiting hours, had hired a third person to scare me, a euphemism for something much more sinister. He doesn't care if you get really hurt, the detective explained. He just wants you to know that he still has power even from inside prison. The plan was simple. I would maintain my normal routine, pretending to know nothing, while undercover officers monitored every move around me. When Richard's envoy appeared, he would be arrested in the act. For 3 days, I lived in a state of constant alert. Every noise made me jump. Every stranger on the street seemed like a threat. On the morning of the 4th day, as I was watering the plants on the balcony, I noticed a man leaning against a post across the street looking directly at me. Our eyes met briefly before I went inside the apartment and signaled to the undercover officer, disguised as a housekeeper who was cleaning my living room. "It's him," I whispered. "I'm sure." The man remained watching the building for about half an hour, then slowly he began to cross the street toward the entrance. The doorman, another undercover officer, let him in without question. I sat on the living room sofa facing the door and waited. My heart was beating so loud I could hear it in my ears. The officer had hidden in the bathroom, the door slightly ajar. The doorbell rang. I took a deep breath and went to answer. "Mrs. Helen Miller?" asked the man, an ordinary-looking individual who could easily blend into a crowd. "Yes. I have a message from your son." Before he could make any move, 3 officers emerged from different points in the hallway, quickly subduing him. The man didn't resist, seeming almost relieved to have been caught. Later that day, Detective Miller visited me to inform me that he had confessed everything. Richard had promised to pay $5,000 for him to scare the ungrateful mother who had abandoned him. "And what exactly did scare mean?" I asked. The detective hesitated. "He was supposed to break some objects in your apartment, make verbal threats, and—" She paused. "And leave visible marks on you. Nothing fatal, but enough so you would never feel safe again." I sat down, feeling my legs weaken. "Is that enough for new charges against Richard?" "Yes. Attempted assault conspiracy to commit a crime threat. This will probably eliminate any possibility of parole in the coming years." A week later, I visited Richard in prison. He seemed surprised to see me, as if he didn't expect me to have the courage to face him again. "I came to say goodbye, Richard," I said, when we sat across from each other, separated by glass. "Goodbye." He frowned. "Yes. The person you tried to scare confessed everything. You're going to face new charges, and you'll probably spend much more time here than you imagined." I paused. "But I didn't come here for that. I came to say that I'm moving on with my life." Richard laughed bitterly. "What life? You're 68 years old, Mom. You're alone." "I'm free," I corrected. "And I discovered that it's never too late to start over. You know, I always defined myself as Edward's wife or Richard's mother. Now I'm discovering who Helen is." He looked at me with a mixture of contempt and confusion. "And who is Helen?" I smiled genuinely. "A woman who finally learned to value herself. A woman who is no longer afraid." Richard hit the glass, frustrated. "You think it's over, but it's not. I'll get out one day. When that day comes, if it comes, I'll be prepared." I stood up. "Goodbye, Richard." As I walked out of the prison, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in decades. The sky was particularly blue that day. The air seemed sweeter. Sarah was waiting in the car. "How did it go?" "Liberating," I replied. "Truly liberating." A year passed since my escape. Autumn arrived in Miami, painting the trees red and orange. My small embroidery business had grown. Now I had 3 students, older women like me, who came every week to learn and mainly to talk. Jessica and the children had visited me twice. Luke and Maya filled my apartment with their laughter and energy, building sandcastles on the beach and collecting shells that now decorated my balcony. Jessica was working as a teacher in her new town, slowly rebuilding her confidence. Richard had been sentenced to 3 more years due to the intimidation attempt. News about him came occasionally through Detective Miller, who had become a friend. As far as we knew, he was quiet, perhaps finally accepting his situation. One Saturday afternoon, as I was returning from the craft fair, I found a woman waiting at the door of my building. She must have been in her 50s with graying hair and a face that seemed vaguely familiar. "Helen Miller?" she asked as I approached. "Yes, my name is Christine Adams." She hesitated. "I was married to Edward before you." I was speechless. Edward had mentioned a previous marriage, only vaguely saying the ex-wife was unbalanced and obsessed with money. Ironies that I could now appreciate. "Would you like to come in?" I finally offered. Sitting in my small living room with 2 cups of tea between us, Christine explained the reason for her visit. "I saw the news about Richard in the paper, about how he manipulated you financially for years." She took a deep breath. "Edward did the same thing to me, and when I read about you, I realized I needed to find you, to close a circle maybe." "How did you find me?" "It wasn't difficult. Your story spread among support groups for women who suffered financial abuse. You became a kind of symbol of resistance." I couldn't contain my surprise. "Me, a symbol." Christine smiled. "A woman pushing 70 who left everything behind and started over facing her own son in court. Yes, Helen, you inspired many of us." We talked for hours. Christine told me how Edward had isolated her from her family, controlled every cent, made her feel incompetent to deal with money. How when she finally managed to divorce him, he left her with practically nothing, only to marry me. A story that seemed to echo my own life. "When he died," she continued, "I felt a strange mixture of relief and anger. Relief because he could no longer manipulate anyone. Anger because there was never justice. He never had to face what he did." "I understand perfectly," I said. "For a long time I only blamed Richard for his actions, but now I see that Edward planted those seeds. Our son only followed the example he saw at home." "The cycle continues," Christine murmured, "unless someone breaks it." At the end of the afternoon, I exchanged contacts with Christine and promised to keep in touch. After she left, I stayed on the balcony watching the sunset and reflecting on our conversation. Edward and Richard, father and son, both now out of my life. One by death, the other by prison. Both leaving scars that I was still learning to heal. That night I wrote in my journal, a habit I had recently acquired. The words flowed easily. Today at 69, I realized I spent most of my life trying to be what others wanted me to be. Devoted wife, doting mother, private bank, always available, always giving in, always afraid of displeasing. Now finally, I'm learning to be just Helen, and discovering that Helen is stronger, braver, and more capable than I ever imagined. The money Richard extorted from me over the years, I can't get it back. The years I spent in a suffocating marriage with Edward, I can't have them back. But the time I have left, this is only mine. To live as I choose, without fear, without manipulation, without regrets. The next day I received an email from Christine. She had spoken with other women who went through similar situations and suggested forming a support group. I accepted immediately. Our first meeting was at a cafe near the beach. There were 5 of us women, all with stories of financial and emotional control by husbands, sons, brothers. We shared our experiences, our pains, our small and large victories. At the end of the meeting, Sarah, who had accompanied me, suggested, "You should formalize this. Create a nonprofit or something. There are many women out there needing to hear these stories, needing to know it's never too late to start over." The idea took shape quickly. In a few months, Rebirth was officially registered as a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting women, victims of financial and emotional abuse. Using my embroidery skills, I created our symbol, a colorful phoenix rising from the ashes. Our first public conference attracted more than 50 women. I was nervous getting on the small improvised stage, but when I started to speak, my voice gained strength. "My name is Helen Miller. I am 69 years old. For almost 7 decades, I allowed others to control my life and my money. First my husband, then my son. Until one day, when my son demanded $300,000, almost everything I had, something inside me broke and reassembled. I looked at the attentive faces in the audience. It's never too late to say no. It's never too late to start over. And it's never ever too late to discover who you really are when you're not living for someone else's approval. The applause was deafening. 2 years after my escape, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Richard, written in a handwriting that seemed more restrained, less impulsive than I remembered. Mom, it's strange to write that word now. I think I lost the right to use it. I'm writing not to ask for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it, but to say that I'm in therapy here in prison. The therapist made me see patterns I couldn't see before. How I repeated with you exactly what Dad did. How I learned to see people as resources, not as people. I'm not making excuses. I'm just acknowledging the truth. And the truth is, you were right to let me face the consequences of my actions. I know you'll probably throw this letter away. And I don't blame you. I just wanted you to know that despite everything, I'm proud of what you've become. I saw your picture in the newspaper speaking to those women. You looked different. Stronger. Richard. I read the letter several times, feeling contradictory emotions. Caution, because I knew Richard's capacity for manipulation well. Sadness for what could have been, and surprisingly a touch of hope. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I took the letter to my next therapy session, another healthy habit I acquired in my new life. What do you want to do? My therapist asked after I read the letter to her. I don't know. Part of me wants to believe he's really changing. Another part reminds me how many times I was deceived before. And what if both parts are right? What if he really is trying to change, but it's still not safe for you to reconnect? Those words stayed with me in the following days. Finally, I wrote a brief response. Richard, I received your letter. I can't say I trust your words. Trust once broken is hard to recover, but I acknowledge your effort in seeking help and reflecting on your actions. My life is now focused on helping women who went through what I went through. I found purpose and peace in that work. I hope you find your path too. If it's a true path of change, maybe we can talk again one day. Not as the mother and son we were, but as two people trying to do their best. Helen. I sent the letter without high expectations. I didn't expect a response, and I didn't receive one for months. That was fine. My life had taken its own course independent of Richard, or the shadows of the past. Spring arrived in Miami, transforming the city with vibrant colors. Our organization Rebirth had grown now with a small office downtown and dedicated volunteers. Twice a week we offered free financial literacy workshops, something I myself had to learn from scratch at 68. Jessica had become a frequent collaborator, sharing her own journey of financial and emotional recovery. My Saturday afternoons were reserved for my grandchildren, who now came regularly to visit. Luke, almost 10, loved fishing on the pier near my apartment. Maya, at 8, had developed an interest in my embroidery. Grandma, she asked one afternoon as we worked on a piece together, are you happy now? The question took me by surprise. I stopped embroidering and looked at my granddaughter, her curious eyes, her innocent face. Yes, dear, I answered honestly, happier than I've ever been. Even without Grandpa and Dad, I chose my words carefully. Sometimes, Maya, we need to distance ourselves from people we love to find ourselves. It doesn't mean we stop loving them. It just means we need to love ourselves too. She seemed to consider my words, her small eyebrows knitted in concentration. Like when I need to be alone in my room sometimes, even though I like playing with Luke. I smiled, admiring her childish wisdom. Exactly like that. In June of that year, I received an unexpected call. It was Detective Miller. Mrs. Miller, I'm calling to inform you that your son is being transferred to a halfway house next month. The news caught me off guard. I thought with the additional charges, he has shown good behavior, completed rehabilitation programs, and his lawyers managed a sentence review. He'll still have severe restrictions, but he can work during the day. I thanked her for the information and hung up, feeling an uneasiness I hadn't experienced in a long time. Richard would be partially free. What would that mean for me, for Jessica, for the kids? I called Sarah immediately. Do you think I need to worry? I asked after relaying the news. Sarah, always practical, replied, We'll increase the security in your apartment just as a precaution. But honestly, Helen, I doubt he'll try anything. He'd have too much to lose. A week later, I received another letter from Richard. Different from the last one, this one was formal, almost distant. Helen, I'm being transferred to a halfway house next month. I wanted you to know from me, not from third parties. I'll be working on a reforestation project during the day and returning to the facility at night and on weekends. I have no intention of seeking you out or interfering in your life in any way. I learned my lessons the hard way. The therapist here says respecting boundaries is the first step to healthy relationships. I'm trying to practice that. I also wanted you to know that I've been corresponding with Jessica about the children. She agreed to let me write them letters under her supervision. Maybe one day I can see them again when she feels it's safe. Richard. The absence of the word mom at the beginning and end of the letter did not go unnoticed. He was truly trying to establish a new dynamic, respecting that our previous relationship was irrevocably broken. I shared the letter with Jessica on our next video call. She confirmed that she was indeed allowing Richard to write to the children. Their therapists think it's important not to completely demonize the father, she explained, and his letters have been different. He asks about their interests, doesn't try to manipulate, doesn't make empty promises. Do you think he's really changed? I asked. Jessica shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe he learned to be more subtle. That's why everything is supervised. She paused. Are you going to answer this letter? I reflected for a moment. I think so, just to establish that I'm aware of the situation and that my boundaries remain intact. My response was brief. Richard, thank you for informing me about your transfer. I wish you well in this new stage. I'm glad to know you're in supervised contact with your children. They deserve a present father if that father can be healthy and positive in their lives. As I said before, I found my path. I sincerely hope you find yours too. Helen. July arrived with intense heat. On a particularly muggy Wednesday, I received an unexpected call. Mrs. Helen, this is Sophia from the Penitentiary Rehabilitation Center. We have a situation with your son Richard. My heart sped up. Is he okay? Physically, yes, but there was an incident at the worksite today. He had an argument with another inmate and, well, he refused to retaliate when provoked. In fact, he walked away and sought out a supervisor. The problem is that marks him as a target for other inmates, and we're concerned for his safety. What does that have to do with me? I asked, confused. Richard requested a transfer to another project, ideally one where he can work alone or with direct supervision. We have an opening in an urban rehabilitation program restoring a public plaza near your neighborhood. But we need your approval, given the history between you. I was silent for a moment, processing the situation. Richard had chosen not to retaliate even when provoked. Something the Richard I knew would never have done. And now he needed my help. Did he specifically ask to work near me? I asked cautiously. No, ma'am. In fact, when we mentioned the location, he hesitated and asked if there were other options. But this is the only project that meets his security needs right now. That surprised me. Richard was really trying to respect my space. What would be the distance between his worksite and my apartment? I asked. Approximately 15 blocks. He would not have permission to leave the project area, which would be monitored. I took a deep breath. Okay, I give my approval. After hanging up, I questioned my decision. Was I being naive again? Or finally exercising compassion without compromising my boundaries? I called Sarah and explained the situation. You did the right thing, she assured me. Keeping Richard safe while he tries to rehabilitate doesn't mean lowering your defenses. It just means you're human and have compassion. In the following week, Richard began his new job at the plaza. On purpose, I altered my route to the market to pass by, keeping my distance. I saw him from afar, planting young trees under the scorching sun. He was thinner, his posture less arrogant. For a moment, he seemed to sense my presence and looked in my direction, but I didn't approach. In August, I received another letter. Helen, I know you saw me at the plaza a few weeks ago. Thank you for not approaching, and thank you for approving my transfer to this project. The work has been therapeutic. There's something deeply satisfying about transforming an abandoned space into something beautiful and useful for the community. I'm not asking for forgiveness or reconciliation. I just wanted to express gratitude for this small act of kindness that I didn't deserve. Richard. The letter was different from the previous ones, more centered, less manipulative. I decided to respond with a symbolic gesture. The next day I left a small box at the community center that supervised the project. Inside were good quality gardening tools and a book on urban landscaping. No note, no expectations. Weeks passed without a response, and that was fine. I had learned that healthy relationships don't demand immediate or calculated reciprocity. In September, our organization, Rebirth, held a major event, a weekend workshop on financial independence for women. I would be the keynote speaker, sharing my journey from total dependence to financial autonomy. On the morning of the event, the hall was filled with nearly 100 women. I took the stage, feeling that familiar mix of nervousness and determination. "Good morning," I began. "My name is Helen Miller. At 70, I'm learning who I am when I'm not being defined by the men in my life." The audience laughed gently, many nodding in recognition. 3 years ago, my son showed up at my door demanding $300,000, almost everything I had. Like so many times before, he counted on my inability to say no. And as many of you know, these patterns don't start from nothing. They are cultivated over decades. In my case, it began with my husband controlling every cent, every decision, making me believe I was incapable of managing my own life. As I spoke, I noticed movement in the back of the hall. A tall, thin figure had entered discreetly and remained standing near the door. My heart sped up as I recognized Richard. For a moment, I lost my train of thought. The audience sensed my distraction, some turning to see what had distracted me. I took a deep breath and continued. The most difficult and most liberating moment of my life was when I finally said no. When I walked out the door with only a suitcase and the determination to no longer be an extension of someone else's bank account. I spoke for 30 more minutes, aware of Richard's silent presence in the back of the room. He didn't try to get closer. He just listened. When I finished, I received a standing ovation. Women approached to share their stories, ask for advice, say, "Thank you." Richard remained where he was, patiently waiting for the crowd to thin. Finally, when the room was almost empty, he approached slowly. He seemed uncertain, vulnerable in a way I had never seen before. "Hi," he said simply. "Hi," I replied. "Your speech was powerful and painful to hear." He paused. "Thank you for the gardening tools." We stood in an awkward silence, two people who were once so close now, practically strangers. "How did you know about the event?" I finally asked. "Jessica mentioned it in a letter. I asked for special permission to come, just to listen." I nodded, noticing how he respected boundaries, asking for permission instead of assuming rights. "Are you okay?" I asked, genuinely curious. "I'm different," he replied after a moment of reflection. "Learning to live with the consequences of my choices. Learning to exist without manipulating or controlling." He met my eyes. "It's harder than I imagined." "It usually is," I agreed. Richard looked at his watch. "I need to get back. I only have 2 hours of leave." He hesitated, then added, "You transformed something terrible into something significant. He searched for the right word. Proud isn't the right word. Impressed, inspired maybe. As he turned to leave, I heard myself say, "Richard." He stopped, turning back. "Would you like to get coffee sometime, in a public place, of course?" The surprise on his face was genuine. Yes, I'd like that very much." "I'm not promising reconciliation," I clarified. "Just a conversation." "I completely understand." He nodded. "It's more than I deserve." A week later, we met at a busy cafe near the plaza where he worked. A discreet corrections officer remained a few tables away, part of the conditions of Richard's temporary leave. The conversation started awkwardly, both of us navigating new territory. We were no longer mother and son in the traditional sense, but two adults trying to find a new kind of connection. "How are the kids?" he asked after ordering coffee. "Good. Luke is fascinated with astronomy lately. Maya is learning to play the recorder." Richard smiled slightly. "They always talk about them in the letters. Jessica sent me some recent pictures." I took a sip of coffee, gathering courage for the question that bothered me. "Richard, what happened? When did you start seeing people only as resources to be exploited?" He looked out the window for a long moment, his profile reminding me so much of his father's that I felt a shiver. "I think it was always like that," he finally answered. "Since I was a kid, I watched how Dad treated you, how he got what he wanted. It seemed efficient." He paused. "In school and college, in business, manipulating people worked, until it didn't work anymore." "And now?" I asked. "Now I'm learning that efficiency isn't everything, that real relationships require reciprocity, not exploitation." He looked at me directly, "that people aren't means to an end." We talked for almost an hour. There were no big revelations or dramatic reconciliations, just two adults sharing experiences honestly, perhaps for the first time. When we said goodbye, Richard asked, "Can we do this again someday?" "Maybe," I replied. "One step at a time." The next morning, as I walked on the beach with Sarah, I reflected on the meeting. "Do you think he's really changed?" my friend asked. "I think he's trying," I answered honestly, "and that's already more than Edward ever did." "And are you ready to forgive?" I watched the waves break on the sand, their eternal rhythm of destruction and renewal. "Forgiveness isn't something you give all at once," I said finally. "It's a daily practice. I'm learning to forgive him and myself for allowing so much for so long." That afternoon, sitting on the balcony of my small apartment, I wrote in my journal, "Today at 70, I'm learning that life rarely offers perfect endings. There are no guarantees that Richard has really changed or that he will continue on this path. There's no certainty that I won't fall into old patterns in moments of weakness. But maybe life isn't about perfect endings. Maybe it's about starting over as many times as necessary, about breaking toxic cycles even when it seems impossible, about believing we can be more than our worst moments or our most painful mistakes." The money Richard demanded that morning 3 years ago was the price of my freedom. A high price, but infinitely less than the cost of remaining trapped in a life that wasn't truly mine. Today, I'm not financially rich. I live modestly. I earn enough selling my embroidery and from small savings, but I am immensely rich in other ways. In genuine friendships, in purpose, in inner peace. In courage I didn't know I possessed. And if there's one lesson I'd like to leave for my granddaughters, for all the women I meet through rebirth, it's this. It's never too late to say no. It's never too late to rediscover who you are when you're not living to please others. It's never too late to start over. At 70, I'm not finishing my story. I'm just beginning to write the most authentic chapters. I closed the journal and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Tomorrow would be another day of work at the organization. Another opportunity to transform my pain into purpose, my experience into guidance for others. The doorbell rang. It was Sarah with a bottle of wine. "To celebrate," she said, walking in. "What are we celebrating?" 3 years since you said no. 3 years of freedom." We smiled and toasted under the sunset sky. "To courage," I proposed. "To Helen," Sarah corrected. Finally living her own life. Now, if you like this story, make sure to subscribe and tell me in the comments what part left you speechless. Oh, and don't forget to become a member for exclusive videos. I don't post here. I'll see you there.